The sky had turned an ominous shade of grey as Mark and Sarah pulled up to the secluded forest farmhouse. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway, a quiet honeymoon far from the chaos of the city, nestled deep within an old-growth forest. The wooden structure was rustic, yet charming, surrounded by towering pine trees that swayed gently in the breeze. "It's perfect," Sarah whispered, though the air felt colder than it should have been for a summer evening. She shivered, blaming it on excitement, but there was something else, something about the stillness of the forest. As they stepped inside, the farmhouse smelled faintly of damp wood and old pine needles. Dust danced in the last beams of daylight that filtered through the cracked window panes. Mark dropped their bags near the creaky wooden staircase and smiled. "It's going to be an adventure," he said, though his voice lacked the usual confidence. He noticed it too, the unsettling silence of the place. Later that night, as they settled into bed, the weight of isolation hung over them like the thick fog rolling in outside. The wind outside picked up, whistling through the cracks in the farmhouse walls. Mark reached over and pulled Sarah closer. "It's just the wind," he whispered, as if trying to reassure himself more than her. But Sarah wasn't so sure. Lying there in the darkness, she felt a strange unease, as though they weren't truly alone. The house felt too quiet, too still, and the forest outside seemed to press in on them, the trees a dark, silent army. Sometime after midnight, Sarah's eyes snapped open. There it was again, a sound, a faint, distant whisper carried on the wind. She sat up, her heart pounding, straining to hear. The air in the room felt colder than before, the chill seeping into her bones. She nudged Mark. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising wind outside. Mark stirred, half asleep. "What? It's probably just the wind," he mumbled, turning over. But then he heard it too. Faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A whisper, a voice, calling. Mark. Suddenly wide awake, Mark sat up, his skin prickling with fear. He threw off the blankets and moved to the window, peering into the darkness beyond. The dense pines stood motionless, the fog twisting through their branches. But something shifted in the shadows, a figure. No, two silhouettes moving between the trees. "Who's out there?" he called. But the moment the words left his lips, the figures vanished, swallowed by the fog. Sarah grabbed his arm, her voice trembling. "Mark, we need to leave." He nodded, but before they could move, the whispering returned, this time louder, closer. The air in the room felt suffocating, thick with something unseen. And then the door to their bedroom slowly creaked open. Cold air rushed in, carrying the unmistakable scent of damp earth, like something or someone had just stepped inside. "Mark, Sarah." Mark stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispering continued, growing into a chorus of voices, too many to count, all murmuring in the same eerie, breathy tones. Panic seized him as the lights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. "We have to go now!" he yelled, grabbing Sarah's hand. They bolted down the stairs, but as they reached the front door, it slammed shut with a deafening crash. The whispering stopped, replaced by a long, unnatural silence. And then, a new sound, soft footsteps dragging slowly across the floor above them. Something, or someone, was coming. Mark and Sarah looked at each other, terror gripping their hearts. Whatever was in that house with them wasn't going to let them leave. Mark's grip on Sarah's hand tightened As the footsteps above grew louder, each deliberate step seemed to resonate through the entire house, making the walls shudder as if something heavy, unnatural, was moving toward them. "We have to get out," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with fear. She glanced around frantically, searching for another way out. The front door was shut tight, almost as if it had been locked by some invisible force. Suddenly, a low, guttural groan echoed from the stairs. Both of them froze. The footsteps had stopped, but something was coming. The temperature in the room plummeted, their breath visible in the cold air. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline coursing through him. "The back door!" he whispered urgently. Sarah nodded, and together they bolted for the kitchen. As they ran, every inch of the house seemed to come alive. The floorboards groaned, the walls creaked, and the faint whispers trailed behind them. They stumbled into the kitchen, the door to the backyard barely visible in the dim light. Mark threw himself against it, fumbling with the rusted latch. It was stuck, jammed from years of neglect. "Hurry!" Sarah cried, glancing over her shoulder. The whispers were back, louder now, and with them the unmistakable sound of something dragging itself down the stairs toward them. The air smelled of rotting wood and wet, decayed earth. A cold sweat broke out across Mark's brow as he yanked on the latch with all his strength. Finally, with a loud crack, the latch broke free. Mark flung the door open just as a shadow appeared in the hallway behind them, a dark, towering figure, its face obscured, but its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Without thinking, Mark and Sarah sprinted out into the night. The cold night air hit them like a slap, the dense fog swirling around them as they tore across the overgrown backyard. The trees loomed like towering figures, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, but they didn't dare look back. Mark could hear it now, the low, unnatural growl echoing behind them, followed by the sound of snapping branches. Whatever was inside the house was now outside. "Run faster!" Mark urged, his voice hoarse, his lungs burning. Sarah's hand was slippery in his, but he didn't dare let go. They reached the edge of the forest, panting and desperate, their legs aching with exhaustion. Behind them, the farmhouse stood in eerie silence, as if the nightmare had never happened. The whispers had stopped, the growl gone, but the tension hung in the air, thick and oppressive. "Is it over?" Sarah gasped, clutching her chest as she doubled over. Mark looked back at the house, his body trembling. It seemed so still, so innocent now, bathed in the moonlight. Then the front door swung open by itself, slowly, deliberately, revealing only darkness within. Something moved in the shadows, watching them. "We're leaving, now!" Mark grabbed Sarah's hand and they bolted for the car parked near the edge of the driveway. He fumbled with the keys, his fingers shaking uncontrollably, but finally the engine roared to life. Gravel sprayed beneath the tires as they sped away, not daring to look back again. As the farmhouse disappeared into the distance, the oppressive weight began to lift. Mark glanced at Sarah, her face pale but determined. They had escaped, just barely. The eerie quiet of the woods now seemed almost peaceful compared to the horrors they'd left behind. But the memory of that house, those whispers, would haunt them forever. Neither of them spoke as they drove through the dark forest road, the fog thinning as they finally broke free of the woods. The house had let them go, but both of them knew they had narrowly escaped something far worse than they could ever understand. As they reached the main road, Sarah whispered, "We'll never go back there, right?" Mark didn't need to answer. He simply pressed his foot harder on the gas, eager to put as much distance between them and the farmhouse as possible. The next story is The Last Road to Nowhere, The Texas sun hung low in the sky as the long stretch of highway unfurled before them, shimmering in the heat. Jacob glanced at the rearview mirror, watching the skyline of the city they had just left slowly vanish behind them. Beside him, Emily was scrolling through her phone, lost in thought. "How much farther?" she asked, her voice soft as she leaned her head against the window, gazing out at the barren landscape. Fields stretched for miles, broken only by the occasional tree or a dilapidated barn. Jacob squinted at the GPS mounted on the dashboard. "About 4 more hours. We should be at your parents' place by nightfall." He smiled, but the atmosphere in the car was thick. The long drive from Texas to their native village always dredged up memories, some good, some not so good. They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the endless highway lulling them into a trance. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, a creeping unease settled in. The sky had turned a strange, bruised color, purples and grays swirling in a way that didn't feel right for a late summer evening. The road ahead was darkening too quickly, the headlights barely piercing the gathering gloom. "The sky looks strange, doesn't it?" Emily said, breaking the silence. She shifted uneasily in her seat, her eyes now trained on the horizon ahead. Jacob shrugged. "Just a storm rolling in, probably." "These old country roads don't have much lighting either. It'll clear up." But there was something in his voice that suggested he wasn't so sure. 30 minutes later, the road had become a winding, narrow path flanked by dense woods. The GPS had rerouted them down this unfamiliar path, claiming it would cut an hour off their trip. At first, Jacob had welcomed the shortcut, but now, as the trees closed in and the sun disappeared completely, he was beginning to regret it. The road had grown rough, with potholes that made the car jolt every few minutes. The deeper they drove, the thicker the forest became, swallowing the car in an oppressive darkness. Emily leaned forward, squinting at the GPS. "Are we sure this is right? It doesn't feel like the way we came last time." Jacob glanced at the screen, which displayed a blinking dot in the middle of nowhere. "I don't remember this road either," he admitted, his voice tight. "But it's what the GPS says. We'll just stick with it." As they rounded a sharp bend, something darted across the road, a blur of movement just in front of the car. Jacob slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching on the asphalt. The car jerked to a stop, and Emily's breath caught in her throat. "What was that?" she gasped, her heart pounding. Jacob was staring straight ahead, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. "I don't know," he murmured. "A deer, maybe?" He leaned forward, squinting into the darkness, but there was no sign of anything on the road, no movement, no sound. For a long moment they sat there in the stillness, the only sound their heavy breathing. Then out of the silence came a low, unsettling noise, a whisper, soft and distant, barely audible over the sound of the wind. Emily's hand tightened on Jacob's arm. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes wide. "It's just the wind," Jacob said, though his voice wavered. He threw the car into drive and pressed down on the accelerator. The car lurched forward, and they continued down the road, but now the unease between them was palpable. As they drove, the whispering grew louder, no longer hidden by the wind. It seemed to follow them, threading through the trees and wrapping itself around the car. Emily's eyes darted to the side window, but all she could see were the shadows of the forest pressing in, darker and denser with each passing mile. "We should have just stayed on the highway," she muttered, pulling her jacket tighter around herself as the temperature inside the car dropped inexplicably. Her breath fogged up the glass in front of her. Jacob opened his mouth to respond, but then, bang! Something hit the roof of the car, hard. Jacob swerved, narrowly avoiding the ditch at the side of the road. The car skidded to a halt, and for a moment, Neither of them moved, too shocked to react. "What the hell was that?" Emily gasped, her voice shaky. Jacob didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the rearview mirror, his face pale. Slowly, his hand reached out and unlocked the doors. "Stay here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Are you crazy?" Emily grabbed his arm. "You're not going out there." But Jacob was already stepping out of the car. The air outside was frigid, far too cold for a summer night, and the wind had taken on an eerie, mournful quality. He circled around the car, his flashlight illuminating only the immediate few feet in front of him. There was nothing. No signs of what had hit the roof, no tracks in the dirt. Just the endless whispering, growing louder now, almost as if it was coming from the trees themselves. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered, then went out. Jacob's heart raced as darkness closed in around him. "Jacob!" Emily's voice called from inside the car, a note of panic rising, but before he could respond, something cold brushed against the back of his neck, like a hand, but wrong. He spun around, but there was nothing there. The whispering was all around him now, the voices indistinguishable, overlapping as if hundreds of unseen figures were gathered just beyond the edge of the light. Panic surged through him. He sprinted back to the car, yanking the door open. "We need to go now!" he yelled. The car sputtered as Jacob turned the key, but the engine wouldn't catch. His breath came in shallow gasps, his hands trembling. Come on," he muttered, twisting the key again and again. The whispering was inside the car now, surrounding them. Emily screamed as the back window fogged over, and through the mist, a handprint appeared. Small, delicate, but unmistakably human. Jacob slammed the gas pedal down, and the car finally roared to life. Gravel sprayed behind them as they sped down the road, the handprint on the window fading into the darkness as they fled. They didn't stop driving until the forest was far behind them, the highway finally coming into view. The whispering was gone, but the oppressive silence remained. "We're never taking that road again," Jacob muttered, his voice hoarse. Emily nodded, still trembling. "Agreed." But even as they drove away, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something, whatever it was, had followed them. And deep in the pit of his stomach, he knew they had barely escaped. The next story is The Hollow Ones. The wind whispered through the narrow mountain pass as Greg tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Beside him, Julia shifted uneasily, her gaze locked on the endless expanse of dark forest surrounding them. The towering pines stretched into the inky black sky, their silhouettes swaying ominously in the breeze. "I can't believe we're doing this," she muttered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "A cabin in the middle of nowhere for our anniversary?" "Really, Greg?" Greg forced a smile, trying to lighten the mood. "Come on, Jules, it's a little adventure, right? No phones, no city noise, just us and nature." Julia's eyes flicked over to him, doubtful. "Nature, huh? More like isolation." She glanced back at the winding road. "How much further is it?" He glanced at the GPS, though it wasn't much help anymore. The signal had been lost half an hour ago. Not far, maybe another 20 minutes. The road ahead seemed to twist and disappear into the woods, the trees crowding closer with every mile. "It'll be worth it once we're there." The photos made it look cozy. As they drove deeper into the mountains, the forest became even denser, the trees looming over them like ancient sentinels. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy, casting long, flickering shadows across the narrow road. Julia squirmed in her seat, her fingers tapping nervously on the armrest. "This place is seriously giving me the creeps," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It feels Wrong. Greg opened his mouth to reassure her, but before he could speak, the car's headlights flickered. Just once. He frowned, glancing at the dashboard. Everything looked fine, but a chill ran down his spine. The lights flickered again, this time staying off a fraction longer. "That's weird," Greg muttered, tapping the dashboard. They continued in uneasy silence, the road narrowing even more. The car jerked suddenly, one of the tires hitting a deep pothole. "Damn it," Greg cursed under his breath, wrestling with the steering wheel. The jolt knocked the GPS off the dashboard, sending it tumbling onto Julia's lap. No signal. The screen blinked, the map frozen in place. "This is ridiculous," Julia muttered, rubbing her arms. "I told you we should have stayed at a hotel." "We're almost there," Greg insisted, though he wasn't so sure anymore. His fingers tapped the steering wheel nervously, eyes scanning the thick trees pressing in on either side. But something in the woods was watching. He felt it. The uneasy sense of being observed, like the forest itself, was alive and waiting. And then they saw it. A figure, just barely visible in the headlights, standing in the middle of the road. Greg slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a stop. Both of them lurched forward, hearts pounding. The figure was motionless, shrouded in darkness, its face obscured by the shadows. "What the hell?" Julia gasped, her voice trembling. Greg's heart raced as he peered out through the windshield. The figure was dressed in dark, tattered clothing, human-like, but something was off. The way it stood, completely still, head slightly tilted as if studying them. The headlights barely illuminated its features, but Greg could swear he saw hollow, empty eyes staring back at them. "What are they doing?" Julia whispered, her hand gripping Greg's arm tightly. "I don't know," Greg said, his voice tight. His mind raced, every nerve in his body screaming that something was wrong. But before he could decide what to do, the figure took a single step forward, then another, and then without warning, it vanished. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone. Julia let out a shaky breath, her eyes wide. Did you see that?" Greg nodded, his throat dry. He could feel the blood rushing in his ears. Yeah, I saw it." Greg shook his head, his fingers trembling on the wheel. "We need to get out of here." He pressed down on the gas, the car lurching forward as they continued down the road, but the tension in the air had thickened. The darkness outside seemed more oppressive, the trees now suffocating them. Julia kept her eyes on the road ahead, her breath shallow. "What the hell was that thing?" she muttered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Greg replied, his voice strained. He glanced in the rear-view mirror, but the figure was gone. The road behind them was empty, though the feeling of being watched hadn't left. And then it happened again. A figure standing in the middle of the road, just as before. This one was closer, too close. Greg slammed on the brakes again, but this time the figure didn't vanish. It stood there, still, unmoving, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Greg's heart pounded in his chest. "It's another one," he whispered, more to himself than to Julia. Greg didn't wait this time. He floored the gas pedal, the car speeding down the road, the tires kicking up dust and gravel. Julia clutched her seat, her knuckles white. "We have to turn around," she cried, her voice trembling. "We can't keep going this way." But Greg shook his head. "We're too far in. The cabin's just ahead." He wasn't sure if he believed it, but he couldn't turn back. Not now. The forest thinned slightly as they sped down the winding road, but the sense of dread only deepened. The air inside the car felt heavy, as though something unseen was pressing down on them. And then, just ahead, the headlights revealed it. A small, run-down cabin, barely visible through the thick fog that had suddenly rolled in. It stood crooked, leaning as though it had been abandoned for decades. The windows were shattered and the front door hung open, creaking in the wind. "That's it?" Julia gasped, her voice filled with disbelief. Greg didn't answer. He slowed the car to a crawl, pulling up to the side of the cabin, but as they stopped, a terrible realization washed over him. The figures hadn't vanished, they were waiting. From the trees surrounding the cabin they emerged. Dozens of them. Hollow, empty figures, their eyes fixed on the car. Silent, motionless. Greg's hand hovered over the gear shift, his heart pounding in his chest. "We're not staying," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He threw the car into reverse, the figures drawing closer, their hollow eyes unblinking. He floored the gas pedal again, the car screeching as it sped backward down the road. The figures faded into the fog as they raced away, their empty gazes following them. As they tore down the road, the cabin disappearing behind them, Greg's hands shook on the wheel. Neither of them spoke, the weight of the encounter settling in like a heavy fog. They didn't stop until they reached the nearest town, far from the cabin, far from the hollow ones. The next story is The Forgotten Inn. The rain poured in sheets against the windshield, and the rhythmic sound of the wipers wasn't doing much to help with visibility. Alex squinted at the road ahead, trying to make out the faint yellow lines that guided them through the downpour. Next to him, Mia sighed and adjusted her seatbelt, peering out at the endless stretch of dark, rain-soaked highway. "This storm came out of nowhere," she muttered, wiping fog from her window with the sleeve of her jacket. "Maybe we should pull over, wait it out." Alex shook his head, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "We're too far from the next town. I just need to find a place to stop for the night." Mia glanced down at her phone, but it had been useless for the last hour. No service, no GPS. They were well off the beaten path, having taken a backroad shortcut to avoid a pileup on the interstate. Now they were paying for it. As the road curved, Alex suddenly spotted a faint light ahead, dim but unmistakable. His heart lifted with relief. "There," he pointed. "Looks like some kind of inn or motel. We can pull over and see if they have a room." Mia squinted through the rain. A sign swung on rusty chains just off the road, barely visible in the gloom. The Evergreen Inn. The building looked old, with a sagging porch and dimly lit windows, but it was shelter from the storm. "It looks kinda creepy," Mia said with a hesitant smile. "But I guess it's better than staying out here in this weather." Alex pulled the car into the gravel lot, the tires crunching softly as they came to a stop. The rain hammered down harder, and the wind howled, making the inn sign creak as it swung back and forth. "Let's get inside," Alex muttered, grabbing their bags from the back seat. Mia followed closely, her eyes darting nervously around as they rushed toward the entrance. The door creaked loudly as Alex pushed it open, the dim light from the lobby spilling out onto the porch. The air inside was warm but stale, as if the place hadn't seen much use in years. The faint scent of damp wood and dust filled the room, and an old-fashioned bell above the door jingled softly as they stepped inside. Behind the front desk, an elderly woman stood, her face illuminated by the warm glow of an old-fashioned lamp. She smiled thinly, her eyes squinting as if she hadn't seen guests in a long time. "Evening," she greeted in a raspy voice. "Looking for a room, are you?" "Yeah, just for the night," Alex said, his voice echoing slightly in the otherwise silent lobby. He glanced around. The inn seemed frozen in time. Faded wallpaper, dusty furniture, and an old grandfather clock ticking loudly in the corner. The woman nodded slowly, reaching beneath the desk and pulling out an old-fashioned key attached to a large wooden block. "Room 5, at the end of the hall." She slid the key across the counter. Mia frowned slightly, noticing the chipped wood and the dust gathered on the desk. "Is it just us staying here tonight?" she asked. The woman's smile didn't waver. "Yes, dear. Just you." Her voice was slow, almost too deliberate. They made their way down the narrow, dimly lit hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet. The walls were lined with old, faded portraits of people long forgotten, their expressions solemn, eyes dark and unblinking. Mia shuddered as they passed them, feeling the weight of the stairs even after they turned away. "This place feels wrong," she whispered, keeping her voice low. "Like it's stuck in the past or something." Alex nodded, but tried to brush it off. "It's just old, that's all. Creepy, sure, but we'll be out of here by morning." They reached the door to room 5 and unlocked it, stepping into a small, musty space. The bed was old-fashioned, covered in a heavy quilt, and the furniture was worn, as if untouched for decades. A single window overlooked the forest outside, the rain still pounding against the glass. "Well, it's not the worst place we've ever stayed," Alex said with a forced chuckle, dropping their bags on the floor. "At least it's dry." Mia didn't respond. She stood by the window, staring out into the storm. The rain blurred her view of the forest, but something about the trees made her uneasy. They swayed in the wind like shadowy figures, shifting and whispering just beyond the glass. As the night wore on, the wind outside seemed to howl louder, shaking the walls of the old inn. Alex and Mia tried to settle in, but sleep didn't come easily. The bed was uncomfortable, the room too cold despite the blankets. And then, just as Mia was beginning to drift off, a soft sound reached her ears. Tap, tap, tap. She opened her eyes, her heart pounding. The sound was faint, coming from somewhere outside the room. She strained to listen, holding her breath. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the hallway. "Alex," she whispered, nudging him awake. "Do you hear that?" Alex groaned, sitting up groggily. "What? What is it?" "There's someone out there," Mia said, her voice trembling. They both listened, the room thick with silence except for that steady tapping. Alex got out of bed, his feet hitting the cold floor with a soft thud. He crossed the room and opened the door just a crack, peeking out into the hallway. It was empty. The portraits on the walls stared back at him, their eyes cold and distant. But the tapping continued, echoing through the narrow corridor. "It's probably just the building," he whispered, though his voice didn't carry much confidence. "Old places like this make noises." Mia wasn't convinced. She pulled the covers tighter around her, her gaze fixed on the door. But as the night dragged on, the tapping didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent. And then, in the middle of the night, it stopped. The sudden quiet felt more unsettling than the tapping. Alex and Mia exchanged nervous glances, both feeling the weight of something they couldn't explain. "Let's leave first thing in the morning," Mia whispered. "I don't want to stay here any longer than we have to." Alex nodded, but before they could settle back into bed, they heard it. A low, dragging sound like something heavy being pulled across the floor. It was coming from the hallway. "What the hell is that?" Alex muttered, his heart pounding now. Mia clung to him as he moved cautiously toward the door, opening it slowly. The hallway was still empty, but the sound continued, closer now. It seemed to come from just beyond the bend in the corridor. Without thinking, Alex stepped out of the room, peering around the corner. His breath caught in his throat. A figure, shadowy, indistinct, was slowly moving down the hallway, dragging something behind it. Its form was twisted, unnatural, like it didn't belong in this world. And then it stopped. The figure turned its head, its eyes meeting Alex's. Hollow. Empty. Alex stumbled back into the room, slamming the door shut. "We need to get out of here," he gasped, grabbing Mia's hand. "Now!" They didn't wait to pack. Rushing down the hall, the air felt heavy, the walls seeming to close in around them. They didn't look back as they fled down the stairs and into the lobby. The elderly woman was gone. The inn was deathly quiet. Outside, the storm had lessened, but the cold rain still stung their skin as they ran to the car. The engine sputtered to life, and Alex floored the gas, gravel spitting up as they sped away from the inn, disappearing into the night. As the rain faded behind them, Mia finally let out a shaky breath. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," Alex muttered, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "But we're never coming back." The next story is The Silent Depths. The sky was painted in deep purples and reds as Ethan and Claire drove down the winding road toward the lake house. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the dense woods that flanked either side of the narrow path. Ethan had rented the secluded cabin for the weekend, a romantic getaway for their anniversary. Claire gazed out the window, watching the trees blur past, a soft smile tugging at her lips. "This is beautiful," she said, her voice soft. "I can't believe you found this place." Ethan grinned, keeping one hand on the wheel. "I thought you'd like it. No phones, no distractions, just us, the lake, and some peace and quiet." The road twisted sharply as they approached the final stretch. The dense forest gave way to a clearing where a small wooden cabin stood at the edge of a vast, mirror-like lake. It looked peaceful, almost too perfect, with its stone chimney and wide porch facing the water. Claire's excitement dimmed slightly as the car slowed. "It's a bit isolated, don't you think?" she asked, her eyes lingering on the dark water of the lake, which reflected the fading light of the sky. "That's the point." Ethan chuckled. "Come on, it's going to be great." They stepped out of the car, the cool evening air wrapping around them like a blanket. The lake was eerily still, its surface undisturbed, as if holding its breath. Claire looked out across the water, feeling a strange sensation of being watched. She shook off the unease and followed Ethan up to the cabin. The inside of the cabin was cozy enough. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a collection of old furniture arranged in front of it. The wooden floor creaked underfoot, and the smell of old wood and lake water hung in the air. Claire set her bags down and glanced around. "It's quaint," she said, trying to sound positive. Ethan laughed. "Quaint? Come on, it's charming. You'll love it once we settle in." He moved toward the back door. "Let's check out the lake before it gets too dark." They walked down to the shore, their feet crunching on the pebbled ground. The lake stretched out before them, dark and endless, reflecting the twilight sky. It was unnaturally quiet, no birds, no insects, just the faint sound of the water lapping gently at the shore. "It's so still," Claire whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "Doesn't it feel weird to you?" Ethan shrugged, skipping a stone across the surface of the lake. The ripples it created seemed to disappear faster than they should have. "It's just peaceful. You've got to learn to relax." He smiled, but there was something forced about it. Claire knelt by the water's edge, running her fingers through the pebbles. A chill crept up her spine as the cold air brushed her skin. She stood up quickly. "Let's go inside. It's getting late." Inside, Ethan started a fire, and they settled in for the night. As the flames crackled and danced in the hearth, the warmth of the cabin seemed to push away the unease Claire had felt earlier. But as the night wore on, a strange feeling began to settle over the house, something Claire couldn't quite place. She woke suddenly in the middle of the night, her heart racing for no reason. The room was cold, far colder than it should have been with the fire still burning low in the hearth. She looked over at Ethan, who was sound asleep, his breathing slow and steady. But there was something wrong with the air. It felt thick, heavy, as if the very atmosphere was pressing in on her. And then she heard it. A faint, splashing sound. Claire sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound was coming from the lake. It was subtle, like something or someone was moving through the water. She stared at the window, her breath catching in her throat. "Ethan," she whispered, shaking his shoulder, "wake up." He groaned, barely opening his eyes. "What is it?" "There's something outside." Ethan sat up, groggily rubbing his face. "It's probably just some animal," he muttered, but Claire could hear the uncertainty in his voice. She got up, pulling the curtains aside to peer out at the lake. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the water. For a moment, everything seemed still again. But then she saw it, a ripple, far out in the middle of the lake. It moved slowly, deliberately, toward the shore. "Look," Claire whispered, pointing. Ethan joined her at the window, squinting into the darkness. "That's weird," he admitted, his voice low. As they watched, the rippling movement drew closer, the disturbance in the water now undeniable. It was as if something was beneath the surface, moving steadily toward the cabin. Suddenly the splashing stopped. Silence fell once more, and the lake returned to its glassy stillness. But the air inside the cabin felt wrong, heavy with tension. "We should go back to bed," Ethan said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I'm not sure we should be here," Claire replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Something's off about this place." Despite their unease, they went back to bed, though sleep was impossible. Claire lay awake, listening to every creak and groan of the old cabin, her mind racing. She was just beginning to doze off when there was a loud, unmistakable knock at the door. Her heart jumped into her throat. She sat up quickly, staring at the door. Ethan jolted awake beside her, both of them frozen in place. "Who the hell would be out here?" Ethan whispered, his voice tight with fear. The knock came again, slow, deliberate, like someone or something was waiting. Ethan grabbed the flashlight from his bag, his face pale. "Stay here," he said, his voice shaky as he crept toward the door. Claire watched him, her heart racing. She heard the door creak open, followed by a deafening silence. Then Ethan's voice, low and trembling. "There's no one here." He stepped back into the room, his face pale as death. "It's just nothing." But there was fear in his eyes, a fear that told Claire something was terribly wrong. They stayed awake the rest of the night, their nerves frayed, every noise amplified by the silence. When dawn finally broke, the lake outside looked calm, serene, as if the events of the night had been nothing but a bad dream. But the heavy atmosphere inside the cabin hadn't lifted. "We need to leave," Claire said, her voice firm. Ethan didn't argue. They packed quickly and rushed out to the car, eager to put the lake and the cabin behind them. But as they started down the dirt road, Claire couldn't help but glance back one last time. The lake was still. But just for a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing at the edge of the water, a shadowy silhouette watching them leave. She blinked, and it was gone. As they drove away, the sense of dread finally began to lift, but the memory of the night lingered. Whatever had happened at the lake, whatever had been lurking in the water, wasn't something they could explain. "Let's not come back here again," Ethan said quietly, gripping the wheel. Claire nodded in agreement, her mind still replaying the events of the night, the splashing, the knock, the figure by the water. Whatever it was, they had escaped, but something told her the lake would remember them. That's all for today. Thanks for listening till the end. Subscribe for more chilling stories.